In October of 1971, the undefeated heavyweight champion of Lumpinee Stadium walked up to a small Chinese man on the steps outside the south gate, and he slapped him across the face. Open hand. Hard. The kind of slap a 260-pound man throws when he wants to humiliate someone before he hurts him. 7 seconds later, the champion was on his back on the wet sidewalk, and he was not getting up. The small Chinese man stepped over him, walked into the Bangkok ring, and got into a taxi. His name was Bruce Lee. He was 30 years old. And what he did in those 7 seconds is a story that old fighters in Bangkok still tell each other when the night gets long enough. This is that story. They tell it carefully. Not the way you tell a fight story to a tourist, loud, with hands moving, but the way you tell something you almost saw, or saw once and were not sure you understood. It happened outside Lumpinee Stadium. A Tuesday or maybe a Wednesday. The men who tell the story do not always agree on the day, and after 50 years the day has stopped mattering. The stadium was on Rama 4 Road back then. The old building. Wooden roof, cracked concrete steps, the kind of place where the air inside smelled like sweat and liniment and cigarette smoke even on the days nobody was fighting. The new Lumpinee, the one with the air conditioning, that one came later. In 1971, Lumpinee was still the old one. The holy one. The small Chinese man walked up to the south gate that evening alone. No entourage. No bodyguard. No camera crew. He was wearing a black silk shirt, untucked, and dark trousers. He was, by the standards of the men standing at that gate, not very large. Maybe 135 pounds. 5 feet 7. The kind of build a Bangkok taxi driver would not look at twice. He bought a ticket. 20 baht. He went inside. He watched 8 fights. He came out again. And on the steps outside, under the tungsten light and the soft red of a beer sign, a man was waiting for him. A very large man. A champion. Someone whose name was painted on a banner that night. Somewhere inside the stadium the small Chinese man had just left. Bruce Lee was 30 years old. He had not yet made the film that would put his face on a wall in every dormitory in the world. In 2 years, he would be dead. But that night, in October, in Bangkok, that night he was still alive, and he had 2 days off from a film shoot in a town called Pak Chong, and he had wanted to see Lumpinee Stadium because Lumpinee Stadium was the holy ground. This is the story of those 7 seconds. And of a man in Seattle, 2 years later, in 1973, who watched a film called Enter the Dragon in an empty afternoon theater, and who, for the rest of his life, for the next 46 years, never said one word about it. That man was my father. To understand what Bruce Lee was doing on the steps of Lumpinee Stadium that night, you have to understand where he had been for the previous 3 months. In July of 1971, Bruce flew from Los Angeles to Hong Kong. He had a contract with a Hong Kong studio called Golden Harvest, a small studio run by a man named Raymond Chow, who had broken away from the bigger studio, Shaw Brothers, and was looking for someone to put his new company on the map. Chow had seen Bruce's audition tape. He had offered him $15,000 for 2 films. $15,000. In Los Angeles, in 1971, Bruce Lee was making $400 an episode for a guest spot on a television show, when he could get one. He had been turned down for the lead in Kung Fu. The network gave it to David Carradine, an actor who could not do martial arts and who was not Chinese. Bruce had been told, politely and several times, that American audiences were not ready for a leading man with his face. So Bruce signed the Golden Harvest contract. The first film was called The Big Boss. In English-speaking countries it was later released as Fists of Fury, which is a different film with a similar title, and the confusion has lasted ever since. It does not matter. The point is that they shot it in Thailand. specifically in a town called Pak Chong, about 150 kilometers north of Bangkok, where the studio could rent an ice factory cheaply and use it as the main location. The shoot was, by every account from people who were there, miserable. Pak Chong in July is hot the way an oven is hot. The ice factory had no air conditioning. The irony of this was not lost on anyone. The food made the foreign crew sick. The director, a man named Lo Wei, spent most of the shoot listening to horse races on a transistor radio while Bruce worked out his own fight choreography in the corner. Bruce got a fever. Bruce cut his foot open on a piece of broken glass during a fight scene and finished the take before he told anyone. Bruce wrote letters home to his wife Linda in Los Angeles, and the letters from Pak Chong are some of the most exhausted things he ever put on paper. But there was one thing about Pak Chong that mattered. Pak Chong was 4 hours by car from Bangkok. And by late October, when the shoot was almost finished, Bruce had 2 days. 2 days off. A weekend, more or less. The crew was setting up for a sequence that did not require him. Lo Wei was happy to have him out of the way. The studio car was available. And Bruce had been thinking, for years, since long before he ever signed with Golden Harvest, since back in the Oakland days, since the magazine articles he read in the back of his school in Seattle when he was 19, Bruce had been thinking about Lumpinee. Lumpinee was the holy ground. If you trained in any martial art that involved striking, boxing, karate, kung fu, any of the styles he had absorbed and dissected and rebuilt, you knew about Lumpinee. Lumpinee was where Muay Thai lived. Not the demonstrations. Not the tourist matches. The real thing. The fights that had no rounds of mercy, no headgear, no concession to the camera. The fights where men used 8 limbs, fists, elbows and knees, shins, the way a violinist uses bow and string and fingerboard in breath. Bruce had read about Muay Thai. He had even sparred with a Thai fighter once, briefly, in a gym in Hong Kong years before. But he had never seen Lumpinee. He had 2 days. He told the studio driver to take him to Bangkok. I think about this part of the story sometimes. The part before it became a story. Because Bruce did not go to Lumpinee that weekend to challenge anyone. He did not go to make a point. He did not go to be seen. He went the way a serious chef goes to a restaurant in another country to taste something, quietly, and to learn. He went as a student. What happened on the steps afterwards happened because someone else made a different decision. My father, in Seattle, would have been 34 years old that October. He was working at a Boeing subcontractor, a small machine shop in the south end of the city, off East Marginal Way, and he came home that evening, the way he came home every evening, and he sat down at the kitchen table, and he ate dinner, and he did not know that on the other side of the world, in a city he had never been to, a man whose name he did not yet know was about to walk up the steps of a stadium and change the next 46 years of his quiet life. He would not see the big boss until it played in Seattle the following spring. He would not see Enter the Dragon until July of 1973, by himself, in an afternoon matinee at the Coliseum Theater on Fifth Avenue. But the silence that started in him that summer afternoon in 1973, the silence about Bruce Lee that lasted the rest of his life, that silence began with what Bruce did on the steps of Lumpinee in October of 1971. Even though my father never knew the story. Even though I am not sure he would have wanted to know it. Some things you recognize in a man without being told. The old Lumpinee Stadium does not exist anymore. They tore it down in 2014. By then it had been the home of Thai boxing for almost 60 years, and the wood of the bleachers had absorbed so much sweat and tiger balm and tobacco smoke that some of the old fighters said you could still smell a fight from 1968 if you knew where to stand. They built a new Lumpinee, much further north, near the army base on Ramintra Road. The new one is clean. It has air conditioning. It does not smell of anything. This is not the Lumpinee Bruce walked into. The Lumpinee Bruce walked into was on Rama 4 Road, in the center of the old city, 10 minutes from the Erawan Shrine and the Embassy District. From the outside it looked like a warehouse with a roof. There was a covered walkway in front, and food vendors set up on the sidewalk before every fight night: grilled chicken on bamboo, sticky rice in plastic bags, sliced mango with chili and salt for the people who liked their fruit to hurt a little. You bought your ticket at a window cut into the concrete wall. 20 baht for the cheap seats, 50 for the middle, 200 for ringside. The ringside seats were not for tourists. The ringside seats were for the gambling men, the syndicate guys, the trainers, the old fighters, the police colonels who liked Muay Thai the way some men like opera. They sat in a square around the ring with their hands in the air, calling out odds in a dialect of Thai that even most Thai people could not follow, and money moved between them in folded 1,000 baht notes that were never quite shown to anyone watching. A fight night at Lumpinee in 1971 was 8 or 9 bouts. They started small, local boys, 16 years old, 110 pounds, fighting for $50 and a chance at a poster, and they built upwards. By the 7th fight you were watching the regional champions. By the 8th or 9th, the main event, you were watching the men whose names ran in the Muay Siam newspaper, the men whose photos hung on the walls of the gyms in Pattaya and Chiang Mai. The main event that October Tuesday was a heavyweight bout. By Muay Thai standards, heavyweight meant something different than in Western boxing. A Lumpinee heavyweight in 1971 was around 250 pounds, sometimes larger. The Thai fighters at that weight were rare. The body type was unusual in Thailand, where the climate and the diet tended to produce smaller, faster men. So the heavyweights were often half Thai, half Burmese, or half Lao, or sometimes Chinese Thai from the north. Big men. Men who had eaten differently, from childhood, than the regional welterweights who came up through the temple gyms. The champion that night was one of those men. I am not going to give you his name. I want to be honest about why. The story I am telling, the story of the 7 seconds outside the South Gate, has been told for half a century. It has been told in Bangkok gyms, in martial arts magazines from the late 1970s, in interviews that Bruce's friends gave after he died, in the memoirs of people who were there. The shape of the story is consistent. The details, the shirt, the gait, the rein, the slap, the count, those are consistent. The name of the champion is not consistent. In some versions he is called by one name. In other versions, another. In the most carefully documented versions, the ones from people closest to Bruce, like Linda Lee Cadwell and Dan Inosanto and Taiki Kimura, the name is left blank, on purpose. Because the champion, whoever he was, did not ask to become a footnote in another man's legend. He had a career. He had children. He had grandchildren who, today, may or may not know what their grandfather did one Tuesday in October of 1971 outside a stadium that no longer exists. There is a kindness in not naming him. So I will tell you what he was, and not who he was. He was, that night, the reigning Lumpinee heavyweight champion. He was 28 years old. He weighed somewhere between 250 and 260 pounds, accounts vary, and Muay Thai fighters in 1971 did not weigh in the way Western boxers did, with a press release and a scale on a stage. He had been fighting professionally since he was 14. He had won, by the time he was 28, somewhere over 100 fights. He had lost maybe a dozen. He had never been knocked out. Never. Not once. And this is the detail that matters. Because in Muay Thai, in 1971, at the heavyweight level, the knockout was not common. Fighters were too durable, too well trained in absorbing strikes, too good at clinching when they were hurt. Most fights went to decision. A man who had fought 100 professional bouts and never been knocked out was not unusual, he was the standard. What was unusual about this champion was the rest of it. He was, by every account, a violent man outside the ring as well as in it. He drank. He fought in the streets when he was drunk. He had been arrested twice, once for breaking a man's jaw outside a bar in Pattaya, once for beating another fighter so badly in a sparring session that the other fighter could not fight again for a year. The Lumpinee organizers tolerated him because he sold tickets. The other fighters avoided him because he could not be trusted to stop. There is one more detail that I want to give you, before we get to what happened. The champion did not like Chinese people. I am not going to soften this. In Bangkok in 1971 there was a long, complicated, sometimes ugly history between the Thai majority and the ethnic Chinese minority who ran much of the city's commerce. It was not, in most of the city, a violent history, but it was a tense one, and at the bottom of the social ladder, in the gyms and the bars and the wet markets, the tension sometimes turned into something uglier. The champion came from that bottom. He had grown up in a slum north of the old airport. He had, throughout his career, made remarks about Chinese fighters, about their size, about their skill, about whether their martial arts were real. He had said, in an interview with a Thai sports magazine the previous year, that no Chinese fighter would last 30 seconds in a Lumpinee ring with a real Thai man. 30 seconds. That was the number he used. Bruce, of course, did not know any of this when he bought his ticket. Bruce did not read Thai. He did not follow Thai sports media. He had no idea who was on the card that night. He had come to Lumpinee the way a pianist goes to hear a symphony in another country, to listen, to learn, to be a small anonymous person in the back of the room. He bought the cheap seat. 20 baht. He sat in the upper bleachers, on the wooden plank, and he watched. He watched, by every account, and there are accounts, there were Westerners in the crowd that night who recognized him, 2 American servicemen on leave from a base in the Philippines, who later wrote letters to friends about what they had seen. He watched the way a man watches who is taking notes inside his own head. He did not move much. He did not eat. He did not drink. He did not talk to the people around him, even when one of them, halfway through the 4th fight, leaned over and asked him in broken English where he was from. He said, Hong Kong. He said it quietly, and he turned back to the ring. He watched for almost 3 hours. 8 fights, by the count of the American who later wrote about it. He left before the main event, before the heavyweight title fight, which is, in retrospect, one of the strange small details of the night, because if he had stayed he would have seen the champion fight, and he might have understood, 10 minutes later on the steps outside, who he was looking at. But he did not stay. He left before the 8th fight ended. He walked down the wooden steps from the upper bleachers, past the food vendors who were starting to pack up, past the ringside men with their cigars and their folded notes, and out through the south gate of the stadium, the gate that opened onto Rama 4 Road, where the taxis waited. It was raining lightly. Bangkok rain in late October, warm rain, not cold, the kind that does not drive you to shelter, the kind you just walk through. The neon of the beer sign across the street was reflected in the wet sidewalk. Bruce stood under the covered walkway for a moment, looking for a taxi. And 4 men came out of the stadium behind him. 3 of them were trainers, or hangers-on, friends of the champion, men who had been with him in the dressing room before his fight, who would be with him afterwards if he won. The 4th man was the champion himself. He had not fought yet. His fight was the main event, still 20 minutes away. He had come out for air, the way fighters sometimes do before a bout, to breathe outdoor air, to clear his head, to let the noise of the stadium leave his ears for a few minutes before he had to walk back into it. He was already dressed for the ring. Red Muay Thai shorts, gold trim. Bare torso. The traditional pre-fight oil already on his shoulders and arms, which was unusual. Most fighters did the oil ceremony just before walking out, but the champion was a man who liked to make himself ready early, and his trainers had stopped arguing with him about it years before. He saw the small Chinese man under the covered walkway. He saw the black silk shirt, the slim build, the careful stillness. And he said something, in Thai, to the 3 men with him. The American serviceman who later wrote about the night did not speak Thai, but a Thai bystander translated for him afterwards, in a bar around the corner, and the translation has been preserved in 2 separate written accounts. What the champion said was, more or less, "Look at this little Chinese. He thinks he can come into our stadium." And he walked toward Bruce. This is where the story, properly, begins. Everything before this, the flight from Los Angeles, the contract with Golden Harvest, the ice factory in Pak Chong, the 2 days off, the studio car, the 20-baht ticket, the 8 fights in the upper bleachers, all of it was prologue. All of it was a man named Bruce Lee living his life and making the small decisions that small decisions are. What happened next was not a small decision. What happened next was about 7 seconds long. And to understand those 7 seconds, to understand them properly, in a way that does justice to the man who did them and the man who received them, we have to slow down. We have to slow down all the way. We have to talk about what Bruce Lee actually was, in October of 1971, as a fighter, not as a movie star, because he was not yet a movie star, and not as a legend, because he was not yet a legend, but as a working martial artist on a Tuesday night in a foreign city with rain on his shoulders and a man twice his weight walking toward him. Because what he did in those 7 seconds was not magic. It was not luck. It was not the movie version of a fight, where the hero waits for the villain to throw the first punch and then unleashes a flurry of choreography. What he did in those 7 seconds was the result of 14 years of work. 14 years of work that almost nobody in the West, in October of 1971, understood that he had done. And to tell you what those 7 seconds looked like, I have to first tell you what was inside them. In October of 1971, Bruce Lee had been training in the martial arts for 17 years. He had started in Hong Kong at 13, in the back room of a kung fu school in Kowloon, under a teacher named Yip Man, who taught a southern Chinese style called Wing Chun. Wing Chun is a close-range system. It does not have the long, theatrical kicks that Westerners associate with kung fu. It has short punches, fast blocks, sticky hands drills where 2 men press their forearms together and learn to feel each other's intention before either of them moves. Bruce trained Wing Chun for 5 years. He was good at it. He was, by the time he was 18, one of the better young students in Yip Man's school, and he had already started getting into street fights on the rooftops of Kowloon, fights that were one of the reasons his parents put him on a boat to the United States in 1959. He arrived in San Francisco. He moved to Seattle. He worked at a Chinese restaurant on Jefferson Street called Ruby Chow's, washing dishes for $1.25 an hour, and he enrolled at Edison Technical School, and then at the University of Washington, and in the basement of the building where he rented a room he started teaching kung fu to anyone who wanted to learn it. Chinese, white, black, it did not matter to him, which is one of the things that would later cause him problems. But the important part of those Seattle years is not the school. The important part is what Bruce did, in private, when nobody was watching. He read. He read everything. He read books on Western boxing, Jack Dempsey's manual, Edwin Hayslett's boxing, the writings of Sugar Ray Robinson on footwork. He read books on fencing. His older brother Peter was a champion fencer in Hong Kong, and Bruce borrowed Peter's library on the European saber and épée traditions and absorbed them. He read books on judo, on wrestling, on savate, on Filipino stick fighting. He read philosophy, Krishnamurti, Lao Tzu, Alan Watts, the Stoics. He filled notebooks. The notebooks still exist. Linda kept them after he died, and they are now in an archive in Los Angeles, and if you read them you understand something that very few people understood about Bruce Lee in 1971. He was not a kung fu master. He was something else. He was a man who had taken every striking and grappling system he could find, in any language he could read, and he had pulled them apart, and he had thrown out everything that did not work in a real fight, and he had kept only the things that did. He had a name for what he kept. He called it Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist. The name was almost a joke, Bruce did not think of it as a style. He thought of it as the absence of style. The absence of the things that did not work. And the central principle of what he kept, the thing that mattered most, the thing he wrote about over and over in those notebooks, was a single idea borrowed from Western fencing. The idea was this: a man who attacks you has to commit. He has to load his weight, lift his arm, decide on a target, and move. All of these things take time. They take, in a trained fighter, perhaps 0.2 of a second. In an untrained fighter, more. In those 0.2 of a second, in that small window between the decision and the strike, the man attacking you is, by the laws of his own body, unable to defend himself. He cannot block. He cannot retreat. He cannot redirect. He is open. The Western fencing tradition called this moment the stop hit. You do not wait for your opponent to finish his attack. You do not block, then counter. You strike into his attack at the moment of his commitment, and your strike arrives before his does. Because his weapon has farther to travel. Because his decision has used up his window. Because he has already given you, by attacking, the only thing you needed, information about where he is going to be in 0.2 of a second. Bruce had been studying the stop hit since he was 22 years old. He had drilled it for 9 years. He had drilled it on heavy bags, on focus mitts, on wooden dummies, on his students at the school in Oakland, on Dan Inosanto in the backyard of Inosanto's house in Carson, on James Coburn in Coburn's living room in Los Angeles when Coburn had asked Bruce to teach him. He had drilled it tens of thousands of times. It was the cleanest thing he did. Now, the champion walked toward him. He came across the covered walkway at a steady pace, not fast, not running, the way a man walks when he wants the other man to know he is coming and to be afraid. The three friends stayed back, near the gate, smoking. They were not going to interfere. This was the champion's moment. The champion stopped about 3 feet from Bruce. He was, as I told you, somewhere over 250 pounds. He was at least a foot taller than Bruce. His shoulders were oiled, his fists were taped from his pre-fight wrap, and he was, in the language of Muay Thai, fired up already in the chemical state a fighter goes into before a bout, full of adrenaline and intent. He said something else in Thai. The witnesses did not catch this one. Then he raised his right hand open, not a fist, and he slapped Bruce across the left side of the face. It was, in Muay Thai culture, a specific kind of insult. The slap before a fight. It was meant to humiliate. It was meant to provoke. It was the kind of thing one fighter did to another in the dressing room or at the weigh-in, never on the street to a stranger, because on the street it was not a sporting gesture. It was an assault, and it was understood as such. The slap landed. Bruce's head moved with it slightly. He absorbed the angle, the way a trained fighter does, instead of being snapped sideways by it. The American serviceman who later wrote the account said that Bruce did not look surprised. He looked, the serviceman wrote, like a man who had just been told the time. There was a half-second of stillness. The champion was waiting for one of three things: for Bruce to apologize, for Bruce to run, or for Bruce to swing back wildly so the champion could counter with the right cross he had been setting up since the moment he saw the black silk shirt. Bruce did none of these. He did one thing. He shifted his weight. In the films of Bruce Lee, the films that came later, the ones that made him famous, you can see this shift if you know where to look. It is in Enter the Dragon, in the opening sparring scene with Sammo Hung. It is in Way of the Dragon, in the alley scene with Chuck Norris. It is the small adjustment of the lead foot, 6 or 7 inches forward, with the back heel coming up off the ground. It looks like nothing. It is one of the most important things a fighter can do. It is the loading of the front kick. In Jeet Kune Do, and in the Western boxing tradition Bruce had stolen from, the front kick from the lead leg is the longest weapon a fighter has. It outranges every punch. it outranges most other kicks. And because it travels in a straight line, from the floor to the target, it is faster, by a measurable margin, than any committed punch loaded from the shoulder. The champion, having slapped Bruce, was now in the wrong position. His weight was forward. His right hand was still extended, just beginning to recoil. His chin was up. Slappers always lift their chin, because the slap pulls the head with it. His feet were squared, not staggered. He was, for a single fraction of a second, exactly the kind of target the stop hit was designed for. Bruce kicked him in the solar plexus. The kick was not a movie kick. There was no leap. There was no spin. There was no shout. The lead leg came up off the floor, the knee chambered, the foot extended, and the ball of Bruce's foot struck the champion just below the sternum, in the small soft hollow of the diaphragm, with the full driving weight of Bruce's hip behind it. A solar plexus strike, properly placed, does not knock a man out by trauma. It knocks him out by reflex. The diaphragm is the muscle that drives the breath. When it is struck hard enough, it spasms. The spasm shuts down inhalation for somewhere between 3 and 10 seconds. The brain, deprived of oxygen and shocked by the vagal response, often blacks out for a fraction longer than the spasm itself. A man hit cleanly in the solar plexus does not fall the way a man falls from a punch to the jaw. He folds forward. His knees go. He lands on his hands and knees, or on his side, and he tries to breathe and he cannot, and his eyes go wide and his mouth opens, and for a few seconds he is not fighting anyone, because the most fundamental thing he is doing, staying alive by inhaling, is no longer working. This is what happened to the champion. He folded. He went down on his knees first, then onto his right side, and his right hand went to his stomach, and his mouth opened, and no sound came out. The 3 trainers at the gate had not yet moved. The slap had happened maybe 2 seconds ago. The kick maybe 1 second ago. None of it had taken long enough for them to process what they were watching. Bruce did not stay to watch. He stepped past the champion, past, not over. The witnesses are specific about this. Bruce was careful not to step over a fallen man, which is in some Asian cultures a serious disrespect, and he walked, at a normal pace, off the covered walkway and into the rain. There was a taxi pulling up under the beer sign. He got in. He closed the door. The taxi pulled away. 7 seconds. The slap was second 1. The shift of weight was second 2. The kick was second 3. The fall was seconds 4 and 5. The walk past was seconds 6 and 7. By the time the trainers got to their friend on the sidewalk and rolled him onto his back and started slapping his face to bring him out of it, the small Chinese man in the black silk shirt was 3 blocks down Rama 4 Road and gone. The champion regained consciousness inside of a minute. He did not, by every account, know what had happened. He knew he had walked over to slap a small Chinese man. He knew he was now on his back on the sidewalk with his trainer's hand on his cheek. He did not connect the 2 events. The neurology of a knockout, even a brief one, even a respiratory one, often erases the seconds before the hit. He sat up. He was helped to his feet. He was walked back inside the stadium. 20 minutes later, he fought his main event. He won. He won by decision, against a smaller fighter who had been brought up from Pattaya for the night. He fought, by every report, badly, sluggish, off balance, wincing whenever he took a body shot, but he won, because he was the champion and the smaller fighter was not, and the judges in Lumpinee in 1971 were not in the business of upsetting the home favorite. He went home that night. He did not, as far as anyone has ever been able to determine, tell anyone what had happened on the steps before his fight. Not his trainers, though they had been there, and they knew. Not his wife. Not the gym. Not the sports magazine that had run his interview the year before about how no Chinese fighter would last 30 seconds in a real Lumpinee ring. He never told the story of the 7 seconds. He continued his career for another 4 years. He retired at 32 with a record somewhere over 120 wins. He opened a gym. He had grandchildren. He died of complications from years of fighting in the late 1990s. The story of what happened on the steps did not come from him. It came from the 3 trainers, eventually, slowly, over decades, in pieces, in bars, when they were old men and the champion was dead and the story could no longer hurt him. It came from the 2 American servicemen who wrote letters to friends. It came from the Thai bystander who translated for the servicemen and who later, in the late 1970s, gave an interview to a martial arts magazine in Bangkok. It came from Bruce himself, eventually, but only in passing, only to a few close friends, only as a small detail in a longer conversation about what he had learned in Thailand on his 2 days off from the big boss. He did not brag about it. He never put it in an interview. He never wrote it down. Linda Lee Cadwell, in the book she wrote after Bruce's death, mentions Bangkok in October of 1971 in 2 sentences and does not mention Lumpinee at all. Dan Inosanto, in the seminars he gave throughout the 80s and 90s, would sometimes refer to a story Bruce told me once about a man in Bangkok but would not give the details unless he was pressed, and even then he gave only fragments. The story stayed where it had happened. In Bangkok. In the gyms. Among the men who had been there or who had heard from the men who had been there. It became, over 50 years, the kind of story you have to earn. The kind of story you do not get told the first time you walk into a Bangkok gym. The kind of story you might hear, eventually, after you have been around long enough that the old men decide you are worth telling it to. I have not been in those gyms. I have heard the story the way most people hear it now, through the chain of accounts, through the books, through the careful ones who got it from people who got it from people who were there. But the shape of the story is consistent. And the shape of the story is this: the smallest man on the steps that night was the only one who knew what was about to happen. Because he was the only one who had spent 14 years learning what to do in a window that opens for 0.2 of a second. There is a part of this story that I find, the more I think about it, the most interesting part. It is not the kick. The kick is the thing people remember. The kick is what makes it a story. The kick is what gets repeated in the bar, 50 years later, by an old fighter who needs to explain to a young fighter why the small man should never be underestimated. But the kick is not the part that tells you what Bruce Lee was. The part that tells you what Bruce Lee was is what happened the next morning. The next morning was a Wednesday. Bruce was back in Pak Chong by sunrise. The studio driver had picked him up at his hotel in Bangkok at 4 a.m., because Bruce had a 6:30 call time on set and Lo Wei did not tolerate lateness even from his star. Bruce arrived at the ice factory at 6:28. He went to wardrobe. He put on the white shirt and the black trousers his character wore in The Big Boss. He drank a cup of tea. He did not say anything about the night before. The crew did not know he had gone to Bangkok. The crew thought he had spent the weekend resting at the hotel. He worked a full day. 12 hours. He did the scene where his character confronts the foreman of the ice factory, the scene that, 8 months later, when the film came out, would make audiences in Hong Kong stand up in the theater and shout. He did not, by any account from anyone on the set that day, seem different than he had on any other day of the shoot. He did not seem rattled. He did not seem proud. He seemed, the script supervisor would later say, the way he always seemed, focused, polite, slightly impatient with anything that wasted his time, kind to the extras and the sound crew, less kind to Lo Wei, who was again listening to horse races on the transistor radio. This is the part one wants you to hold. A man, less than 12 hours earlier, had committed an act of complete and disciplined violence against another man on a sidewalk in Bangkok. And by 6:30 the next morning, that same man was on a film set, drinking tea, hitting his marks, treating the lighting technician with the small careful courtesy he treated everyone with, and not telling anyone what he had done. There is a word for this in some of the older martial traditions, Japanese, Chinese, Thai. The traditions all have their own version of it. The word means, roughly, to put down the weapon when you put down the day. It means, when the fight is over, the fight is over. You do not carry it. You do not relive it. You do not tell it as a story to make yourself larger. You did the thing that had to be done, and now the thing is done, and now you are drinking tea, and the tea is what is in front of you, and the tea is what matters. Bruce had this quality. He had it not because he was a saint, he was not a saint. He was a complicated man who lost his temper, who could be vain about his physique, who fought with directors and studio heads and sometimes with his wife, but he had it about violence, specifically. About the use of his hands and feet against another human being. About that, he was clean. He did not carry it. He did the thing, and then he stopped. The other thing he did, and this is the part that nobody who tells the bar version of the story bothers with, is that he asked, a few weeks later, after the shoot was over, to be put in touch with a Muay Thai trainer in Hong Kong. He had a friend in Hong Kong who knew someone, and a meeting was arranged in a small gym in Bangkok, and Bruce went, alone, with no entourage, and he asked the Thai trainer, through an interpreter, to teach him. He paid. He took regular sessions. He learned the elbow strikes, the clinch work, the low round kick that had been used at Lumpinee for 600 years. He worked in the gym for an hour at a time, twice a week, between film shoots, for almost 6 months. He did not tell anyone he was doing this. The trainer, in an interview years later, said that Bruce was the most attentive student he had ever taught, that Bruce never argued, never tried to show off what he already knew, and that Bruce, on the day of his last session, gave the trainer a small handwritten card that said, in Cantonese, "Thank you for what your country taught me." The trainer kept the card. He showed it, once, to a journalist in 1993, when he was old. He said, "He was the only foreigner who ever thanked me." This is the part of the story that nobody puts in the bar version. Because it is not a fight story. It is not an action movie. It is not a clean ending where the small man kicks the big man and walks away into the rain. It is what happened after. It is the part where the small man, having proven what he needed to prove on a sidewalk in Bangkok, went home, kept it to himself, and then went and learned more, went and put himself, voluntarily, back at the bottom, at the foot of the very tradition that had sent the champion to slap him. There is a phrase Bruce used in his notebooks, in English, that he had borrowed from a Zen text. He wrote it on the inside cover of one of the notebooks, the one he was using in 1971 and 1972, the notebook that was on his nightstand when he died. The phrase was, "Empty your cup." It meant, do not come to a teacher full. Come empty. If your cup is full, the teacher cannot pour anything into it. If your cup is empty, the teacher can fill it. Bruce, who had just kicked a man across a sidewalk in 7 seconds, who knew better than almost anyone alive in 1971 exactly what he was capable of, walked into a small gym in Bangkok and presented himself to a Thai trainer with an empty cup. This is a thing very few 30-year-old men can do. It is a thing very few 30-year-old men, having just done what he had done, would even think to do. It is one of the reasons that, 50 years later, the story still gets told. Not because of what he did to the champion. Because of what he did the next morning. And the next week. And the 6 months after that. There is a small footnote to the morning after, and I want to give it to you before I move on, because it is the kind of detail that the bar version of the story always loses. The script supervisor on The Big Boss was a Hong Kong woman in her late 20s named May. She is not famous. She did not write a memoir. But in 1986, 15 years after the shoot, she gave a short interview to a Cantonese-language film magazine about her time on the production, and in the interview she mentioned one thing. She said that on the morning of Wednesday, in late October, she did not remember the exact date, Bruce came to set with a small cut on the inside of his lower lip. Not a visible cut. The kind of cut you get when something hits the outside of your face hard enough to push the inner cheek against the teeth. She noticed it because she had to do continuity for a close-up, and she had to ask the makeup woman whether to cover it. She asked Bruce what had happened. Bruce, she said, smiled at her, the small private smile he had, the one that did not show his teeth, and said, in English, "I bit it eating dinner." That was all he said. May did not believe him. She did not press. She told the makeup woman to cover it, and they shot the scene, and the cut healed in 3 days, and nobody ever asked about it again. The slap had been hard enough to split the inside of his mouth. He had absorbed it without flinching, kicked the man who delivered it, walked into the rain, slept 4 hours in a Bangkok hotel, ridden 4 hours back to Pak Chong in the dark, and arrived on set with the only physical evidence of the night being a small cut on the inside of his lip that he lied about, gently, to a script supervisor who did not believe him. I think about this small lie sometimes. I think it is one of the kindest things I have ever read about Bruce Lee. Because he did not lie to protect himself. The truth would not have hurt him. He lied because he did not want May to have to carry the story. He did not want the makeup woman, or the lighting technician, or the boy who brought the tea, to have to know that their lead actor had, the night before, hospitalized a man on a sidewalk in Bangkok. He kept it off them. He took it home alone. This is, I think, the thing that separates a certain kind of man from every other kind of man. The willingness to carry a thing alone, so that nobody else has to. My father went to see Enter the Dragon on a Tuesday afternoon in July of 1973. He went alone. He did not tell my mother he was going. He took an early lunch from the machine shop, he was a foreman by then, and he could take an early lunch when he wanted to, and he drove his 1968 Ford pickup downtown. And he parked on 5th Avenue, and he bought a ticket to the 2 o'clock matinee at the Coliseum Theater. The Coliseum is gone now. They tore it down in 1990. There is a department store there now. But in 1973 the Coliseum was the largest single-screen theater in Seattle, 2,100 seats, a balcony, a red velvet curtain that closed between showings. The 2 o'clock matinee was almost empty. My father later told my mother this was the only thing he ever said about that afternoon, that there were maybe 15 people in the theater. Mostly older men. A few teenage boys who should have been in school. One Chinese family in the back. He sat in the middle, 6 rows from the screen. The film started. He watched it. He came home at 6:30. He ate dinner. He read the paper. He went to bed at 10 the way he went to bed at 10 every night, and the next morning he went to work, and he did not, for the next 46 years, until he died in October of 2019, he did not say one more word about the film. Not one word. He did not say whether he had liked it. He did not say what he had thought of Bruce Lee. He did not say whether the fight scenes had impressed him or whether they had not. He did not buy any of the books. He did not watch the film again, as far as anyone in the family knows, even when it played on television in the late 70s and the 80s, even when it became, by the 90s, a thing you could rent on VHS at the grocery store. He did not put up a poster. He did not own a Bruce Lee t-shirt. He did not, when I was 11 years old in 1994 and going through my own Bruce Lee phase, the phase that every American boy of a certain age went through, he did not say to me, "I saw him. I saw the film when it came out. I was there." He just let me have it. He let me have my own version of the man, which was the version of the man on the wall of my bedroom, the one with the yellow tracksuit and the bow staff, the one who was a poster. He had seen something else. I do not know what he had seen. I will never know. He died in October of 2019 in the same house in Seattle he had bought in 1971, the year Bruce had stood on the steps of Lumpinee, and in the months after his death I went through his things, the way the children of dead fathers go through things, and in the bottom drawer of the desk in his study I found, folded into the back of a manila envelope, a single ticket stub. Coliseum Theater. July 24, 1973. 2 p.m. He had kept it for 46 years. He had not framed it. He had not shown it to anyone. He had folded it once, vertically, and put it in the back of an envelope, in the bottom drawer of a desk in a room where almost nobody but him ever went. I sat on the floor of his study with that stub in my hand for a long time. And what I thought about, sitting on that floor, was the small cut on the inside of Bruce's lip, the morning after Lumpinee. The thing he had carried alone so that May would not have to carry it. The thing he had lied about, gently, because the truth was his and he did not need to share it to make it real. My father was the same kind of man. I had not known this about him while he was alive. I had known he was quiet. I had known he was hard to read. I had known he did not talk about feelings or films or anything that mattered to him. I had assumed, the way children of quiet fathers always assume, that the silence meant absence, that there was nothing inside the silence, that the silence was the man. The ticket stub told me I had been wrong. The silence had not been absence. The silence had been a thing he was carrying. A thing he had carried for 46 years, alone, because he did not want to put it on anyone else, and because the saying of it would have, in some way he understood and I did not, made it smaller. My father had recognized something in Bruce Lee in July of 1973, in an almost empty theater on Fifth Avenue, and he had recognized it well enough to know that it was the kind of thing you did not talk about. He had recognized, I think, the man who walked away from the steps of Lumpinee and bit his lip and lied to the script supervisor. He had recognized the carrying. And he had decided, that afternoon, sitting in the middle of the Coliseum Theater with maybe 15 other people in the dark, that the right way to honor that man was to carry his own things the same way. In silence. Until the end. There is a thing I want to say about the 7 seconds, before we close. The champion did not lose because he was untrained. He was not untrained. He had 100 professional fights. He could absorb shots that would have killed most men. He had fought, by the time he was 28, at a level of physical violence that almost no Westerner, including Bruce, had ever experienced inside a regulated ring. He lost because he did not know one thing. He did not know what he was looking at. He looked at Bruce and he saw a small Chinese man in a black silk shirt. He saw weight. He saw height. He saw the things you can see with your eyes in 2 seconds on a sidewalk. He did not see the 17 years of training. He did not see the notebooks. He did not see the 9 years of stop-hit drilling. He did not see Yip Man in Kowloon, or Edwin Hayslip's boxing, or Peter Lee's fencing books, or Dan Inosanto in the Carson backyard, or the wooden dummy in the Oakland school. He saw the surface, and he made a decision based on the surface, and the decision was wrong. This is, in the older traditions, called the first failure of the warrior. Not the failure of skill. The failure of perception. The failure to see what is actually in front of you, before you decide what to do about it. Bruce had spent his entire adult life training the opposite habit. He had trained himself to assume that every man he met was, until proven otherwise, more dangerous than he looked. He had trained himself to look, before he moved. He had written, in one of the notebooks, "The man you cannot read is the man who will hurt you. Read first. Then decide." The champion did not read. He saw a small Chinese man and he decided in 2 seconds that he was going to humiliate him, and the decision used up his attention, and by the time he raised his open hand to slap, he was no longer looking at Bruce. He was looking at the slap. He was looking at his own hand moving through the air. He was looking at the thing he was already doing. This is the moment Bruce had been training for since he was 22. The moment when the other man stops looking. That is the window the stop hit lives in. Not a physical window, a window of attention. A window where the attacker has shifted his focus from the target to the strike, and in that shift he has, for 0.2 of a second, become unable to see what the target is doing. Bruce kicked into that window. The kick was the easy part. The kick was the result. The kick was the thing the body did because the eyes had been doing the right thing for 14 years. What happened on the steps of Lumpinee was not, in the end, a fight. It was a perception, against an absence of perception. It was a man who had spent his life learning to see, against a man who had spent his life learning to be seen. There is a kind of justice in that. Not a moral justice. The champion did not deserve, in any real sense, what happened to him. He had been a bully and a racist, but bullies and racists do not generally deserve to be put down on a sidewalk, even briefly, but a structural justice. The kind of justice that happens when a system meets the system that was built to defeat it. Bruce did not invent Jeet Kune Do to beat Muay Thai champions on sidewalks. He invented it because he had spent his adolescence in Hong Kong street fights and his early 20s watching kung fu schools turn out students who could not actually fight, and he had decided, somewhere around 1964, that he was going to spend his life building a system that would work against any other system, in any environment, against any opponent, including opponents twice his size. In October of 1971, on a wet sidewalk in Bangkok, the system worked. That is all. That is the entire content of the 7 seconds. The old Lumpinee Stadium does not exist anymore, but if you walk down Rama 4 Road today, the way I did in February of 2023, on a trip I took partly to see the place, you can still find the corner where it stood. There is a hotel there now. A mid-range business hotel, 8 floors, beige stucco, the kind of hotel that has a small pool on the roof and a buffet breakfast included in the room rate. Across the street, where the beer sign used to be, there is a 7-Eleven. Bangkok in 2023 is a 7-Eleven on every corner. I stood on the sidewalk where the south gate used to be. I stood there for maybe 20 minutes. The traffic on Rama 4 is loud. It was loud in 1971 too. The witnesses mentioned the traffic and tuk-tuks went by, and a delivery man on a scooter stopped to buy a cold drink at the 7-Eleven, and a woman in a business suit walked past me talking on her phone in Thai, and none of them knew that 52 years earlier, on the spot where they were walking, a man had folded onto his side and tried to breathe and could not. You cannot put a plaque on a thing like this. There is no plaque. There never will be. The story is too small. In one way, it was 7 seconds, it was on a sidewalk, it was not in any newspaper, and it is too large in another way, because the man who walked away from it became, 2 years later, an icon whose face is on more walls in more countries than almost any other face in the 20th century, and the story of the 7 seconds got swallowed by the icon, the way small true things often get swallowed by large famous ones. But the corner is still there. And the rain, in October, is still warm. I went back to my hotel that evening, and I sat on the small balcony of the room, and I called my mother in Seattle on the phone. She was 81 years old then, for years a widow, and I told her I had been to the place where the story happened. She said, "Your father would have liked to know you went." I said, "Why didn't he ever talk about Bruce Lee, Mom?" She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I thought the call had dropped. And then she said, "Because some men, when they see the thing they wanted to be, they don't talk about it. They just try, for the rest of their lives, to be a small piece of it. Quietly. Without making a fuss." She said, "Your father tried. In his own way." She said, "I think he did all right." We hung up a few minutes later, and I sat on the balcony, and the Bangkok night was warm the way Bangkok nights are, and somewhere down the street a motorbike went past, and somewhere a few blocks away a man was probably teaching his son how to throw a kick in a small gym above a noodle shop, the way men in Bangkok have been teaching their sons how to throw kicks for 600 years. Bruce Lee got back to Pak Chong on a Wednesday morning in late October 1971, and he drank a cup of tea, and he did not tell anyone what he had done, and he went to work. My father walked out of the Coliseum Theater on Fifth Avenue in Seattle on a Tuesday afternoon in July 1973, and he did not tell anyone what he had seen, and he went home and ate his dinner, and he kept the ticket stub in the bottom drawer of a desk for 46 years. 2 months after Bangkok, Bruce went back to Hong Kong and started shooting a film called Fist of Fury. The film made him, by the spring of 1972, the most famous man in Asia. Within 18 months he would be the most famous man in the world. Within 21 months he would be dead. But that is another story. And in that story, too, there is a man who was not warned about who he was meeting. And in that story, too, there is a moment that takes 7 seconds and changes the rest of a life. We will tell that one next. Until then, thank you for sitting with this one. Quietly. The way the story was meant to be told.